Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Happy Halloween. And in honor of the spookiest day of the year, I bring to you a review of Agatha Christie's Halloween Party, which is really the only Golden Age mystery novel set at Halloween. I mean, technically, it's not really Golden Age, and I'm sure there are others from like lesser known writers that are escaping me at the moment, but Ellery Queen's Calamity Town takes place partially on Halloween, but I mean, this is really the only major full on Halloween murder mystery from a Golden Age author that I can think of. Which is a bit of a shame because it's really just like ripe for the genre, and also because this book isn't really that good, but I'll get there. And it took me way too long to reread this novel, so if you're mad about me having to push back Josephine Tay, blame this book, but this book isn't all bad, as I'll get into. It's probably one of like the better, lesser Christie's, if that makes sense. Bad probably isn't the right word. It's not bad. It's a bit lackluster, shall I say. And as a reminder, I will have a spoiler-free section up until the point of the murderer reveal, at which case I will warn you it's coming. And from that point on, spoilers are fair game. Before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. Halloween Party begins in the small village of Woodley Common in the house called Apple Trees, very heavy on the autumnal setting here, where Mrs. Ariadne Oliver is helping set up for a children's Halloween party. And by helping, I mean not doing much of anything. She's just standing around talking about pumpkins and vegetable marrows and eating the apples meant for the bobbing for apples tub. The party is thrown by Rowena Drake, who is this nucleus of a woman in that she seems to have her hand in everything in town, even though like she doesn't hold any position of power or influence. The party is for the quote 11 pluses, that is children aged 11 through 17, and there's a bunch of games like Snapdragon, bobbing for apples, and whatnot. There's this thing where like the girls look into a mirror and see their alleged future husbands. There are a lot of characters in this setup slash party sequence. Mrs. Oliver, being a famous author, is the big catch, though. And she's very popular with the children, especially one Joyce Reynolds, whose age is unknown. She's in like the 12 to 14 range, maybe. I mean, at one point she said to be 13, but like no one seems to actually know. It's unclear and it changes a lot. No one seems to know her real age, even her own mother. But anyway, she brags to Mrs. Oliver that she saw a murder once. And Joyce is immediately called out as a liar. No one believes her because she always makes up stories to impress people, and when the others press her for details, Joyce can't answer anything. She said it happened a long time ago when she was a child, which, I mean, she's still a child, and she didn't go to the police or tell anyone about it because she didn't realize it was a murder at the time, and then she forgot about it. Absolutely no one believes her, and they laugh at her and tell her to shut up because she's being rude. The talk then turns back to the party where Rowena Drake and the local teacher Elizabeth Whittaker discuss like what kind of tub is best for the bobbing for apples and other preparations. The Halloween party happens later that night, and we meet Judith Butler, who is a local mother, but her daughter Miranda cannot attend the party because she's too sick. Nicholas Ransom and Desmond Holland, two of the older teenagers, they play the role of the future husbands. And then the party chapter just ends uneventfully. I'll get more into this later on, but obviously, this book is very oddly structured, and the information is presented to us sort of like all mixed up from what it should be. Again, this is 1969, this is late career Christie. It does feel like it in the writing, not in the plot. We're not at that point yet, but the writing and the structure are very loose and sloppy. Cut to the next day. Hercule Poirot's dinner date with his friend Solomon Solly Levi is cancelled and replaced with a meeting with his old friend Ariadne Oliver. Mrs. Oliver is all upset and rambles on and on about apples and all kinds of things. Poirot finally gets it out of her that at the Halloween party, Joyce Reynolds was murdered when someone held her head underwater in the bobbing for apples tub, which is certainly one of the more gruesome murders in Christie. This method actually feels like very Nio Marsh-esque, actually. Mrs. Oliver tells Poirot everything, and She begins to suspect the obvious conclusion that Joyce really did see a murder somewhere in Woodley Common. Poirot tries to get a feel for the situation, which leads to like this really odd conversation about whether or not Joyce was attractive or if this was a potential sex crime. Sex crimes get mentioned a lot in late career Christie, as does senseless violence crimes. You can definitely tell Christie, like most older people, read the newspapers a lot and became cranky and curmudgeonly. There's a lot of disdain for the present day in this book, and it comes from all kinds of characters, especially Mrs. Oliver, who is Christie's mouthpiece. Now, I always think we can assume Mrs. Oliver's thoughts are Christie's thoughts, but no, Mrs. Oliver says there was none of that. So they begin working under the assumption that Joyce did see this unknown murder and someone at the party is the killer. But then they wonder, like, well, if Joyce did see this murder, why would she announce this with the murderer present? Which is a very good question. Poirot and Miss Oliver go to Woodley Common, where Poirot reunites with Superintendent Spence, whom he worked with in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. Spence is now retired and moved to Woodley Common to live with his sister Elspeth McKay. Spence doesn't really know the local gossip, but he promises Poirot he will find out. Poirot and Mrs. Oliver go around and visit several people, none of whom provide any real information, and they all just repeat the same talking points, basically. No one thinks Joyce actually saw a murder, even after her death, because she was a liar, and a pretty good one. Like, people usually believed her lies until she would get caught up in them and exposed. Joyce was an attention seeker and lied for the attention. We learned from her brother Leopold and her sister Anne, who are just absolute doozies, that Joyce once convinced everyone she went on a trip to India with her uncle, but she was just repeating someone else's story as her own. Everyone thinks Joyce was murdered, not because she said she saw a murder, but just because it's all the rage to go around murdering people these days, because, young people suck and are out of control. Everybody's getting murdered by out of control young people who like rock music and do drugs. This is a sentiment expressed by pretty much every character in this book, including Poirot. Honestly, if this book had been published in 2024, I would have suggested Christie had like cable news brain rot. She brings up young people committing crimes, especially sex crimes, constantly in this book, and she creates the impression that England is basically like the Clockwork Orange. There are constant references to senseless crime and basically as a pastime, and we're told pretty much every young man is a mental case. It's easily the worst thing about this novel. It gets very old very quickly, and it becomes whiny at times, but that's what everybody thinks happened to Joyce, even though there's no evidence to suggest that. The only person who thinks Joyce did see a murder was her mother, and that's clearly the case of the mother not wanting to call her daughter a liar. Poirot learns from Rowena Drake that the murder happened late into the party, probably when everyone else was playing Snapdragon. Poirot asks her if anybody was wet, because the murderer almost certainly got wet when drowning Joyce. But the problem is, a lot of people were wet because they had just done the bobbing for apples, and there were other activities, so that's not helpful at all. Spence and his sister come up with a list of 4 possible murders Joyce may have witnessed, even though they don't think Joyce witnessed anything either. The first is Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe, who is Rowena Drake's aunt through her late husband, but also through Rowena Drake herself. It's very weird because Rowena Drake and her husband were cousins, but they always refer to Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe as her husband's aunt, which is weird. Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe died of heart problems, which she suffered from. Her death was not suspicious at all, but because she was a wealthy woman, Spence thought she should be included. She's the type of person like ripe to be murdered, and what's more suspicious isn't her death, but the subsequent disappearance of Olga Semenoff. Olga Semenoff was an au pair girl who apparently inherited everything from Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe, but that codicil was determined to be a very bad forgery, and then Olga disappeared when this was discovered. That meant the estate went mostly to Rowena Drake, but also to a gardener who was left the lodge and some money to take care of these lavish gardens Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe adored and created on her property. There is Charlotte Benfield, a young shop clerk who was bashed on the head with a rock and no killer was discovered. There is Leslie Ferrier, who was stabbed to death. He was a shady lawyer who worked for the law firm Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe used, and he had spent time in prison for forgery and other crimes, because, of course, if he did, he's a young man in Halloween party. And the final potential victim is Janet White, who was a teacher who was strangled to death. Poirot is most interested in her because a strangulation might not appear to be murder at first glance, and because Janet White was a teacher and Joyce was a child, it would make sense that she might have been around her. Weirdly, we were told by multiple people that there weren't any murders in Woodley Common Joyce could have witnessed, and yet there are at least three. There's also more. So that's a plot hole. There are multiple plot holes in this book. Poirot visits the Elm School to inquire about Janet White. Miss Emlyn is the headmistress and a friend of Miss Bulstrode from Cat Among the Pigeons, and she too doesn't really provide any information and just repeats what everybody else says about violent young men and Joyce being a liar. She sends Poirot to Miss Whittaker, a teacher at the school who was at the Halloween party, where we go through the same spiel again. She, however, actually does have some new information. She tells Poirot Janet White was living with a woman named Nora Ambrose, who has since moved away, and that a man was probably stalking Janet. The not-so-subtle implication here is that Janet and Nora were a lesbian couple. Miss Whittaker refuses to talk about it more. She also tells Poirot that during the game of Snapdragon, she left the room and saw Rowena Drake drop a heavy vase on herself after appearing to be startled by something in the library. Poirot then visits Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe's gardens. These are very lavish gardens Poirot describes as mythological. There he meets two people. One is Michael Garfield, whom Poirot takes an instant dislike to. Michael is the gardener Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe left the lodge for so he could live in the garden, and she was also left him her house, apparently which he sold for very little money. Michael explains that he likes the gardens, but they aren't his vision. He was just enacting Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe's vision, so he dumped it. Poirot also meets Miranda Butler, this would be Judith's daughter, and really Joyce's only friend. Miranda likes to hang out in the garden's trees where no one can see her, but she can see everything. Poirot describes her as a wood nymph and her mother as a water nymph. And Miranda is so perfect and so lovely. It's so overmuch how much praise is just heaped on Miranda. And I will get into that later. Don't think I'm going to ignore this very odd depiction of a child. It's actually borderline disgusting at times. But Miranda also doesn't think Joyce saw anything and brings up a pretty good point that Joyce was a braggart, and there's no way she would have waited a year or two or three or however long to tell someone she witnessed a murder. Judith suggests that Joyce may not actually have witnessed the murder, but there still could have been a murder that happened. Poirot visits yet some more people, and this is pretty much all he does in the middle part of this book, just visit different people who say mostly the same thing over and over again. He visits Rowena Drake and asks her about the vase. She has no real explanation for it, and Poirot is suspicious that she actually did see someone in the library, but was keeping quiet to protect that person. He asks her about Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe and Olga Semenoff, and she doesn't really provide any good information there, except she tells Poirot about her husband, Hugo Drake, who was disabled by polio and was killed when someone drove into him with a car. The killers were never identified or caught, so this makes at least the fourth murder Joyce could have seen. Why this wasn't included on Mrs. McKay's list, I have no idea. He also visits Mr. Fullerton. This would be Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe's lawyer. He explains a lot more about Olga Semenoff. Fullerton did not draw up this codicil that was present that left everything to Olga Semenoff, and it was immediately identified as a forgery. Olga actually went to Mr. Fullerton for help and begged him that she was telling the truth and to help her. Mr. Fullerton, who is now working for Rowena Drake, sent her away as a pest and tells Poirot Olga obviously left England because she was going to be arrested for forgery. Olga, it was mentioned many times, could write in Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe's handwriting because she didn't like to write her own letters. Fullerton only has nice things to say about Leslie Ferrier, although why a respectable lawyer hired someone who went to prison for forgery of legal papers is not addressed. However, after Poirot leaves, we get a very unusual chapter of Mr. Fullerton's inner thoughts. This is very extensive and odd for such a minor character here. In this, we learn that Mr. Fullerton actually regrets treating Olga the way he did. He feels bad, although he doesn't really believe she was innocent, so that's odd. Poirot proceeds to meet with even more people who repeat the same things once again. He visits Nicholas and Desmond, the two teenage boys. This is at least refreshing because they actually don't repeat the same things. Poirot doesn't really learn anything from them, though, but they have very interesting theories. They specifically say that Janet White and Nora Ambrose were lesbians, which I think we can safely assume was the case. I mean, these two teenagers are actually very interesting characters, although they do have undesirable traits about them. More about that later. Poirot then moves on to Mrs. Goodbody, who is the village witch. That's how she describes herself. She also played the witch at the Halloween party. She doesn't provide much either. Who does provide us with some new information is Mrs. Lehman. Mrs. Lehman, sort of out of the blue, goes to Mrs. Oliver for whatever reason instead of Poirot. She worked as a cleaning lady to Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe, and she tells Mrs. Oliver, who later tells Poirot, that she actually witnessed Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe ride out the codicil, leaving everything to Olga Semenoff. She didn't know what it was at the time, but when she witnessed it and she signed the codicil, but when Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe asked her to, she then later looked at it and learned what she signed. Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe had placed the codicil in an old book, which again makes no sense. Mrs. Lehman never said anything about this after her employer died because she thought Olga had somehow tricked Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe into leaving her everything. So Mrs. Lehman believed that she was all right for Olga to be accused of forging the codicil that she knew wasn't forged. There's a lot with Mrs. Lehman that doesn't make sense. There's a lot in this book that doesn't make sense. Again, I'll get into that later. But for now, we'll just accept that story as it is. When Poirot checks up on the codicil, Mrs. Lehman's signature is not on it. The other witness is the landscaper named Jim Jenkins, who did witness the codicil along with Mrs. Lehman, so that's weird. Poirot also learns from Michael Garfield that Olga Semenoff was friendly with Leslie Ferrier, and the two may have been romantically involved, which could have led to his murder since he was seeing another woman who was already married. Poirot comes across Michael Garfield painting Miranda Butler, and if you're like me, you're wondering why this strange man is painting young girls in the woods and talking about how innocent and beautiful she is and why no one finds this at all bizarre. This would have been an episode of To Catch a Predator for sure if it existed at the time. And for all the talk in this book about weirdos and sex criminals, there's just no commentary on how odd this is. But anyway, they talk about how nice the gardens are and how Rowena Drake hired Michael to work on her own gardens, but he doesn't like what she wants and he wants to leave for Greece. Miranda talks about a magical well that's somewhere hidden in the garden, but it's all sealed up now. Poirot returns to Spence's house where there is a message from Mr. Goby, who is a character I've always hated. He's just really a cop-out to supply Poirot with information there's just no other way of providing. He's basically an info dump personified. But anyway, Poirot had Mr. Goby look into Olga Semenoff in mainland Europe, and he says Olga never returned to her home country like everybody believed. Her friends had never heard from her since she allegedly left England, although she did write a few times previous to that and mentioned an unmanned name she was involved with, which Poirot assumes is Ferrier. Poirot goes back to Superintendent Spence and his sister, where Rowena Drake is waiting for him. She tells him that Leopold Reynolds, that would be Joyce's weird younger brother, is dead. Someone drowned him in the river. And Poirot reacts to this in the most nonchalant way imaginable. This is yet another dead child that elicits no reaction to him. In fact, Poirot really seemed to hate Leopold. It's really unnatural, actually. But Rowena Drake then admits that she spilled the vase on her, but it wasn't an accident in the way she described it. She says she saw Leopold in the library when Joyce was drowned, and she became frightened because she thought Leopold had killed his sister. Everyone sort of comes into place here for Poirot, although he claims he's known for a long time. So this is where I end the spoiler-free section. Back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. Poirot has Mrs. Oliver bring Judith and Miranda to her flat in London for Miranda's safety. You would think that Judith Butler would do anything for her daughter's safety, but she doesn't really want to go to London, and then when she agrees, she doesn't want to bring Miranda with her, which is like, what is she even doing at this point? She even goes as far as to say she should leave Judith with the Reynolds, whose children have been murdered, and Rowena Drake, which we'll get there. Eventually, Mrs. Oliver does get both Judith and Miranda out of Woodley Common. They stop at a diner where Miranda runs away when she goes to the bathroom. We know she gets to a car with an unnamed person. She also made a phone call before she left her house, allegedly to a friend, but we can assume otherwise. In the meanwhile, Poirot returns to the Elms and asks Miss Emlyn two things, one of which is not told to us, but the other is about the character of Nicholas and Desmond, to which Miss Emlyn says they are good boys and trustworthy. Back to Miranda, who was brought to a site of a pagan ritual sacrifice, because of course she was. The ending of this book goes way off the rails here. Miranda takes a cup of poison, and she's apparently knowingly and willingly sacrificing her life to correct a wrong, and that wrong would be the death of Joyce. She's about to drink from this cup when Nicholas and Desmond run out to stop her. They actually yell like hell she does, and when this unnamed person convinces her to drink. And I should just name that person now. It's Michael Garfield, but Michael Garfield did not kill Joyce. We sort of get this explanation to us all over the place, so I'll just clean it up a bit here. Rowena Drake murdered Joyce. This is what happened. Joyce did not witness a murder like she claimed. This is actually a very clever clue in that Joyce was a liar and bragged a lot about fantastical things that didn't really happen to her. But Miranda is the person who did witness the murder in question. Miranda told her best friend Joyce, but she never told Joyce what she saw or who she saw or where it happened or any detail like that. Because Miranda was too sick to attend the party, Joyce was able to tell Miranda's story as her own. The murder that Miranda saw wasn't actually a murder, to be honest, but she saw Rowena Drake and Michael Garfield carrying Olga Semenov's dead body through the garden. At first, Miranda thought Olga had injured herself and didn't realize that Rowena and Michael had actually murdered her until later on, at which point she just didn't say anything. Rowena had always felt they were being watched that day, and when Joyce said she had seen a murder, Rowena lured her into the library and drowned her in the bobbing for apples tub. Rowena got wet from this, which is why she intentionally dropped the vase on her in front of Miss Whittaker so she'd have an excuse for being wet. Because she's an adult, Rowena Drake did not bob for apples at the party, so she would have no explanation for being wet like the children would. Poirot realized that Rowena Drake is not the type of woman to be startled and drop a vase on her, so she must have done it on purpose. And while no one believed Joyce's story, Rowena couldn't take the risk that she was lying. She and Michael Garfield conspired to murder Olga Semenov because Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe really did leave her estate to Olga. The codicil was genuine, but they hired Leslie Ferrier to create an obvious fake one to discredit Olga. They murdered Leslie Ferrier to cover their tracks and made it look like it was some kind of lover's quarrel. They then murdered Olga and dumped her body in the garden well to make it look like she had fled England when the forgery was exposed, but before she could provide the real codicil. This is actually pretty clever. I do quibble a lot with the execution and the plot holes of it all, but the storyline is actually pretty good. We're never told who murdered Leopold, but he was blackmailing Rowena because he caught her murdering Joyce. The Miranda stuff is iffy and requires connecting the dots that aren't explained, but what I think happened is Miranda felt guilty and responsible for Joyce's death, so she told Michael what happened, and then Michael essentially brainwashed Miranda into believing she should sacrifice herself to make up for Joyce's death. Oh, and Michael is Miranda's father, which, isn't all weird. Nope, not at all. Poirot also speculates that Michael wanted the money to build his own Greek garden in the Mediterranean, but also needed Rowena Drake's money, so he was probably having an affair with her, which led to Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe disinheriting Rowena, and that Michael would probably have eventually murdered Rowena at some point. This is normally where I would get into praise, but first, I have a theory update. In a previous video, I discussed the unanswered question of what happened to Hugo Drake. Was he murdered? And I speculated in that video that Rowena Drake probably didn't kill her husband because for reasons, the possibility still existed. But having just now reread the book, I feel much more confident that she did not kill him. We're told by a few people in Woodley Common whom we can trust that Rowena and Hugo's marriage was a happy one. Moreover, we are also told, and to be fair, this information partially comes from Rowena Drake herself, so grain of salt, but that Hugo Drake was killed by someone who stole a vehicle and then ran him off the road. And the police say they have an ID of that vehicle and an idea of who stole it, so it does seem that his death was an accident. I think a lot of the speculation comes from the constant references of Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe being Hugo's aunt, but she's also Rowena's aunt as well. Hugo and Rowena were cousins, which does get mentioned, but not as often, really. But we are told that Rowena would get the money anyway, so she didn't need to murder her husband. And although Hugo Drake died before Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe, at a time when it wasn't known Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe was going to die, so, why would Rowena murder her husband then? There are still some lingering questions, was Rowena having an affair with Michael when her husband was still alive? I think that's probable, but it doesn't prove she murdered her husband. If anything, and I actually just thought of this, Michael Garfield very well could have murdered Hugo Drake. That's much more likely, but again, why he would do so when Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe is going to live for a while, as far as anyone knows. There's no indication she was murdered, so I feel pretty confident Rowena Drake did not murder her husband. There's still some lingering doubts, but I feel more confident that she didn't. Praise. And I have to be honest here, this is going to sound worse than I mean it, but this book is a lot better to me when I'm thinking about it than when I'm actually reading it. I don't have a lot of praise for it, but I do have one large and very important piece here, and that is I think the plot of this book is excellent. I really enjoyed and appreciated the actual mystery at hand. And while Christie's skills are clearly not as good as they once were, her plotting here is still full of satisfying gems. I love the puzzle here and the clues. Joyce says she saw a murder. Everyone says Joyce is a liar. The clue, Joyce is lying, but someone had to see him murder. Who? The only person who liked Joyce and wasn't at the party, Miranda. Miranda spends a lot of time in the garden treetops. Who works in the garden? Michael Garfield. Michael Garfield's involved in the murder. I find that puzzle just so good and so typical of Christie when she's at her best. It's not difficult to make that connection. It's all there, plain as day, but a reader is likely to miss all or some of that. And I think the murder of drowning in the bobbing for apples tub is brilliantly gruesome, very fitting for Halloween. It's almost like horror movie-esque. I don't think Christie gets enough attention for how spooky and scary she can be, and that's largely because her scary stories are mostly unknown short stories that didn't feature her recurring characters, but this one does. And especially around this time in the late 60s, Christie is getting a bit spooky. By the pricking of my thumbs and The Pale Horse are written around this time. Endless Night's a little spooky too. And to be fair, by the 60s, her books were all coming out in October, November, so that would make sense. I'm a fan of these sort of murder in the past affecting the present type novels. Christie does get, I think, a little overboard here toward the end of her career doing this, but I did find Halloween Party having those possible murders interesting enough. Not the best use of it, but still decent. And the other big plus for this novel is the setting and the atmosphere. I think Christie does a very good job here. I feel like how I know exactly what Woodley Common looks like. I got major M. Night Shyamalan village vibes here as this secluded village in the woods, and it's autumn, so the trees are bare. I always felt this anxious eeriness wherever Poirot or Mrs. Oliver went. It sort of lingered over Woodley Common. I thought it was very well done. Unfortunately, this book has major issues. When I ranked all 33 Poirot novels, I placed Halloween Party at number 27, which I thought was kind of low, and I fully expected it to move up quite a bit. But now having reread it again, I think 27 is about right. I don't think it goes lower. There are a lot of construction issues. Just to pull a few of these, and this is by no means exhaustive of the issues of this book. We have Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe making a codicil that she considers real, but then hides it for no explanation. We have the housekeeper knowing this and then just not saying anything for years with no explanation. Then all of a sudden she reveals this to Mrs. Oliver, totally unmotivated and unprompted. It doesn't make any sense. And we have what I think a lot of people consider a clue, but I actually don't think it is. Rowena Drake is allegedly able to commit this murder by guiding the planning of the party in such a way that she can murder Joyce privately. And she insists on using this like big sturdy tub so it won't spill over under pressure. But the problem is that the narration tells us Rowena Drake did all of this before Joyce said she saw a murder. So Rowena Drake was planning a murder before she knew she was going to commit one. This type of thing would only happen in late career Christie. She wouldn't make that mistake even 10 years earlier. We're told by many people there weren't any murders in Woodley Common that Joyce could have witnessed, only for us to learn there were multiple, very high profile murders she could have witnessed, and that this list also leaves out Hugo Drake. I think the structure of this book is bad. It's a lot of Poirot like going from place to place and having this muddled and disorganized conversations with different people. There are times he mentions meeting with like the local police inspector, which didn't happen. And this book needed refinement and cleaning up. The clues are not very well laid in. I know this gets like a lot of praise, but Rowena Drake dropping that vase on herself to get wet was, to me, extremely obvious the very first time I read this book. It's pretty apparent what she was doing, especially since she never really gives an answer as to why she did that. And there are all these supposed, like, multiple murders that Joyce could have witnessed, but the way Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe stuff is given such a focus, it's very obvious that's the one that's important, and it only incriminates Rowena Drake. And we also have times like where people can't make the connection that like, oh, Leslie Ferrier was murdered. He was a forger. We have a forgery going on here. And like people can't make that connection. There are multiple gaping plot holes I've already mentioned. I do think it is a bit strange that Miranda didn't recognize two people were carrying a dead body. She also claims she didn't know where the well was in the gardens, but then she said they dropped the body in the well, so she had to know where it was. I think also pretty awful depictions of children in this book. I'll talk a little bit more about them in their individual character sections, but children are depicted pretty terribly and often really bizarrely, unrealistically, and just sometimes just disgusting ways. And I think it's unintentional on Christie's part. Relatedly, there are way too much complaining about young people in this book, and it comes from all sorts of characters. And this is like cable news brain rot here. I know some people would say, oh, it's just a red herring, but I don't think it is. Rowena Drake brings it up. Yes, that's she could be doing it for that. But these are views Poirot has, Mrs. Oliver has. No, I think Christie is using characters as an outlet to voice her own opinions about young people and how they just go around committing violence all over the place. It's built into the story. And then we have some other things that are just ridiculous, like all of this pagan sacrifice stuff with Michael and Miranda. It's not grounded in reality. And in fact, that Michael is Miranda's father is absurd and comes out of nowhere totally unnecessarily. It's also very gross. To be fair, there are clues of this, but that's also disgusting. I'll get there as well. The ending of this novel is totally off the rails, and it just sort of ends. Like, I don't get the satisfactory everything clicked into place here, even though there are elements that should. And there's also some other minor issues I won't harp on, but a lot of these characters just don't get any page time. I was surprised when I reread this that even the likes of Miranda and Judith Butler and even Mrs. Oliver to an extent really are far less prominent than I think one assumes when thinking about this book, and certainly far less than I remembered. I think it's a problem that Michael Garfield comes in this book way too late for a murderer. It comes about around the halfway point. That's too late, and Miranda comes in around the same time. I think this book would have been just astronomically better if the plot were retained, but was just executed better. And the execution is really holding it back. An editor should have picked things up on this, but by this time in her career, Christie's editors were just not doing that, and they were extremely hesitant to say anything about this to her. And I think the book suffers because of it. Moving on to characters, we have Hercule Poirot, who I don't know. This was a bit of a mixed bag for him. I think he was delightful when he was with Mrs. Oliver, and they had a lot of fun banter about growing old, and Mrs. Oliver teasing Poirot about wearing patent leather shoes in the country, and he should wear sneakers, and he's just horrified at that thought. She calls him a computer at one point, but when he was separated from her, he felt very subdued. I did not feel that Poirot I know and love when he was simply talking to the other characters. But I mean, he does do his usual tricks. It's not like he's a totally different person here, but I did feel he lacked those character moments outside of his time with Mrs. Oliver and even Spence to a degree. He claims he knew Rowena Drake was guilty right away. I don't know. I didn't really feel like he did. I do like how he saves Miranda in the end by getting her out of town and confiding in Nicholas and Donald. That's a very Poirot thing to do. But again, there was a lot of time where he just wasn't popping for me. Ariadne Oliver was a fun presence as well. Her teasing of Poirot was just spectacular, rubbing him over his shoes and his clothes and poking fun at his methods. She was her usual slightly scattered self. I love the opening chapter of her at the party setup, and she's doing absolutely nothing to help except get in the way, which was funny. I like that her presence was the catalyst for Joyce's murder. We don't often see Mrs. Oliver incorporated directly into the murder plot like that. It does happen in Dead Man's Folly, but I just love Mrs. Oliver in this book and her frustrations in dealing with Judith and how she basically has to physically yank Judith to safety. There's also this recurring joke of Mrs. Oliver being obsessed with apples. We see that in all of her appearances, but now because of Joyce's murder, she switched to dates, which is funny. And of course, Mrs. Oliver is our Christie stand-in, although we don't get a lot of anecdotes about writing, and she did have some odd views about young people again, which is why I can't give Christie the benefit of the doubt here. When it's in Mrs. Oliver's mouth, we know it's Christie's thoughts and opinions. Superintendent Spence returns from Mrs. McGinty's dead. He was fine. I'm not pining for Spence, but I think his appearance makes a lot of sense in this book because it's very similar to Mrs. McGinty's dead. Poirot visits a country village where he feels very out of place, tries to solve the murder of a victim who witnessed allegedly one of 4 previous murders. There's a lot of reminiscing in this book about past Poirots, mostly Mrs. McGinty's dead, a lot of labors of Hercules as well. But Spence doesn't really add much to the story other than to allow Christie to reflect, which she does in a lot of her late career. Again, he was fine. I could have done without him. It wouldn't have mattered much to me. We have 2 murderers to discuss. Let's start with the main one in Rowena Drake. I liked her as a character, but again, I think there was more to bring out in her. She's a local woman who knows everybody's business and runs everything. We're told she's very composed and serious. The murderer reveal for her wasn't that surprising. I did feel like it's pretty obvious she murdered Joyce. I assume she murdered Leopold as well. That's not clear. We're never told. I never got the sense she was this greedy person who would kill for money or was somehow in love with Michael Garfield or under his spell. It's not totally unbelievable, but I do find her sufficiently evil that I can believe. I absolutely believe she would murder children, but there are aspects of her personality I just don't find as credible. I had her ranked at number 58 of 100 Christie culprits. I think that's about right. Maybe a few spots lower. And she's not the only older female Christie killer seduced by a younger man who I found not totally credible, although she's far more credible than the other one. Again, I think she could have been a better character than what she was, but alas, not to be. Our other killer is Michael Garfield, and I guess we don't really know if he actually killed anyone. I guess he killed Olga and was going to kill Miranda, but I find Michael Garfield to be very unsettling, and even though this is a Halloween novel, it was not unsettling in a good, spooky way. Definitely To Catch a Predator material. He's obsessed with beauty and the finer things in life, loves gardens and mythology. He's so narcissistic, he has no problems murdering people for his own gain, including his own daughter. But the problem is I don't think Christie means for him to come across this way, but he's creepy as anything, and again, not in a good way. Miranda is his daughter, and again, it's not clear he knows this, but I mean, let's be honest, he definitely knows this. He painted her as Iphigenia, who, in Greek mythology, is the daughter of Agamemnon, who is sacrificed at a marriage altar. And this is very gross because it's basically what Michael does to Miranda, although he stopped. There are a lot of similarities between Michael and Agamemnon, and even Rowena Drake and Clytemnestra, who is Iphigenia's mother. I had Michael Garfield at number 35 of 100 Christie killers. And I remember thinking at the time that was a little high, but I justified it because he's so incredibly evil. I think I would lower him at least into the 40s, just because he's so uncomfortable and kind of skeezy. It's not something you want to read in a murder mystery, to be honest. We have quite a few victims to discuss. Let's start with Joyce Reynolds, our main victim. I liked her as a character. I think her obnoxiousness and her lying added a lot of suspense to the book. Now, her character itself is pretty bad. There's just not a lot of caring about Joyce. And I think that's fine. As Poirot points out, it doesn't matter that she's a child. If she's a liar and people didn't like her, that's important to know. But we do get odd descriptions of like her physical appearance, and no one seems to know how old she is, which is very weird. It's like Christie just couldn't be bothered with that. And there's a complete lack of mourning for her, even amongst her family. But this is a murder mystery, and I know I'm not necessarily a stickler for them being like super realistic down to the nitty gritty details, but the lack of mourning amongst her family was noticeable. But I did like Joyce as a victim character, and her constant passing off of other people's stories as her own was a very important clue. I love when Christie uses the victim's personality as a clue. I think she did that very effectively here, actually. Leopold Reynolds is our other in book victim, and this murder was just not very good. It felt very thrown in there, added nothing to the plot, and was basically an afterthought. I'm pretty sure Christie forgot she had put this in here, and we barely saw Leopold during the novel as it was, and when we did, he was this unpleasant child in a murder mystery. I mean, he's not a credible blackmailer at all. I assume he was blackmailing Rowena. That's not even explained. He's like 10. I find it very difficult to believe a 10-year-old would be sophisticated enough to be a blackmailer, and a blackmailer who got money out of this victim. I guess he's supposed to be super smart because he always plays around with like chemistry sets, but Leopold came across as just like a totally unrealistic character. He didn't care his sister was dead. There was no reaction whatsoever. And Poirot also like really has this unnatural hatred for Leopold for like no reason. Like even before he's revealed as a blackmailer, like Poirot just hates him, and it's very strange. And like for Poirot to be judging Leopold, a 10-year-old, by the same standard he judges an adult. He actually says that in the book. I think Leopold failed as a character as well. I think he was arguably the worst character in this book. And I also think it's pretty telling that the Suchet series ages Leopold up quite a bit to make the story make more sense. Olga Semenoff is another victim, and we got a pretty good sense of who she is, despite never meeting her on the page. She's a classic Christie victim in the sense that the reader never sees her, or everything we know about her is told to us from other people, and it's all unflattering, and all these other people have reason to slander her. It turns out she was nothing like what we were told, and we see this victim again and again. And I think Olga is a fine enough version, but certainly not better than others in this archetype. I liked how she was from Slovakia, which is a fictional country we see very early on in Christie thrillers like The Secret of Chimneys, but I mean, the name is actually slightly different, but I assume that's what Christie meant. And there's a good deal of sympathy shown to her, which is something those other characters often don't get in the end. I feel like an Arlena from Evil Under the Sun and Ruby Keene from The Body in the Library are in this archetype with Olga, but when we find out the truth about them, it's just sort of like brushed off. With Olga, there is sympathy for her that Rowena and Michael and Leslie Ferrier stole her money and framed her as a forger and murdered her. And we have that chapter that feels totally out of place from the lawyer who remembers when he threw Olga out of his office when she was begging and afraid. Really showing Olga's true nature. And we don't get this a lot with these victims, and we don't even get that from these other victims in this book. But this is almost the reverse Body in the Library, where the allegedly promiscuous, trashy young girl gets zero sympathy, and the young girl gets a ton of it. It's the opposite here. And we have Leslie Ferrier as well. Not a lot to say about him. I mean, he seemed kind of like a jerk. I have no idea who he hired him, what kind of respectable law firm hires someone who served time for forgery, but it did come off as very like boys will be boys type thing. And he gets murdered by Rowena and or Michael, we don't know. To me, this murder really made no sense. Not that it happened, but in the way that it was covered up as like some kind of lovers quarrel brawl gone bad, which it's like, why didn't they just dump his body with Olga's? Like, how did they murder him in public without anyone watching? I don't know. It didn't really seem well thought out at all, which was a disappointment because Leslie seemed like definitely like the good like jerk victim, the one you kind of like see when I get when they get done in, you sort of like cheer a little bit. But unfortunately we didn't really get any of that. And she's not technically a victim, but I might as well bring her up here. Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe. And, I got shades of Miss Marple from her, not in personality, but in the opposite behavior. Around this time, Miss Marple had to give up gardening for her health. And Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe also had to do that, but she didn't and died. And her personality, though, was just so off for me. Her actions didn't make any sense unless you, subscribe to this theory that she was looking into Rowena and Michael, but, that didn't appear to be the case. I don't understand why she didn't use her lawyers to write up the codicil, why she hid the codicil in a book, what happened to the real one, how did they find it? If this codicil was so well hidden, that how was it able to be forged? It doesn't make any sense. And there's a lot here that needed to be explained, and we really can't glean anything because we don't really know Mrs. Llewellyn-Smythe's personality that well. So, again, a lot of surrounding her created a number of plot holes that were very noticeable. Let's move on to some regular characters. There are a lot, so I'm just going to pick out the major ones. I did not care for Miranda Butler. She's about 13, but it's just so tiring, the constant descriptions and talk of how pretty she is and how perfect she is. Christie lays it on pretty thickly, and it's not effective, and I'm not sure, what even she was trying to do with Miranda. I guess she's trying to pull off, this spunky, feisty young adventuress like she did earlier in her career, but it fails, and I do not view Miranda as a likable character, and her actions are also both too mature for her age and also just don't make sense. She does not feel like a child except when Christie needs her to be naive and innocent, and then she becomes a character who's much younger than she really is. She's very clearly inspired from Miranda from The Tempest, but it's just way too much with her, and she's very inconsistent and just not that likable. I don't think she's a successful character at all. And her mother, Judith, was a real pip. I mean, she didn't really do much over the course of the novel. She didn't add anything to the plot. And she's not a good mother, we know that. She's constantly letting Miranda go out with strangers in the garden. And to be fair, she does know Michael is Miranda's father, so I guess she assumes Miranda is safe with him, but she also knows how horrible of a person Michael is, and she's so nonchalant about things. I mean, she doesn't even tell Miranda Joyce was murdered, and she doesn't want to leave Woodley Common until Mrs. Oliver basically has to drag her away. And still, then, she doesn't even want to bring Miranda and wants to leave her with Rowena Drake, who is a murderer, or the Reynoldses, whose children have been murdered. It's what is she doing? And she's another character I think we're supposed to be fond of, but just aren't. Again, I think Christie fails to accomplish what she wants with Judith, and it just leaves Judith rather questionable as a character. Elizabeth Whittaker is the local teacher. She was fine. I mean, she's the one who witnessed Rowena Drake drop the vase on herself and misinterpret what happened. She's very perceptive most of the time. She provides a lot of insight into Janet White, even though she also claims she doesn't want to say anything about Janet White. I mean, she definitely knew Janet's secret and is staying silent about it. I thought she was a fine character. Again, we don't see a lot of these characters who you would assume would play a big role, but I like what we did see of her. Miss Emlyn was a good character. I mean, Christie does a good headmistress. She's not as good as Miss Bulstrode, but even more so than Miss Whittaker, Miss Emlyn provides useful insights into the other characters, one that is actually helpful. She's the one who tells Poirot that Joyce was a liar, but she wouldn't make anything up, implying that this was someone else's story she was telling. And Poirot really trusts Miss Emlyn. A lot of the characters tell Poirot the same thing over and over and over again, but when Miss Emlyn says it, Poirot is much more inclined to believe it. And yet Poirot trusts her judgment about Nicholas and Desmond, and I assume he told her the solution before it was revealed. We don't actually know what he wrote on that paper he gave her, but I personally found Miss Emlyn the best of these regular characters in the novel, but she was very close to the next characters I'll talk about. And I'll just lump them together, but I really liked Nicholas Ransom and Desmond Holland, and they are a little older than the other children. I believe they're 18, and I really love the description of them. They felt very much of the 1960s. Christie gets a lot of things wrong about young people in this era, and in these books, especially in the '60s. Like she doesn't connect with it well. But I thought her description of Nicholas and Desmond was fantastic, and I liked how they were redeemed in the end by saving Miranda, and it sort of cuts against what I largely knocked Christie for with her unpleasant portrayal of young people, and this is a counterclaim to that, and one that was much needed. But despite that, though, there's still a lot of unpleasant shade thrown at them. We're told one of them, I think it was Nicholas, has a tendency to be violent and was in an asylum at one point. And they also seem to be a little perverted, which I guess this is Christie trying to be humorous with her depiction of teenage boys, but they speak in innuendo at times, words that have other meanings. I mean, for instance, they talk about how much fun it would be to bob for melons instead of apples, and they get very specific as to why. And they also talk about Janet White being a lesbian, and you can very much tell this is something they've thought about a lot previously, probably fantasized about it. But overall, I thought they were wonderful characters and mostly positive. I think the impression we're supposed to have of them is that they are good people in the end, and I think that does ultimately come through. And the final person I'll talk about is Elspeth McKay, Superintendent Spence's sister, who lived in Woodley Common. And she provides a lot of the background information and those murders Joyce may have witnessed. She's the total opposite of her brother, whereas Spence is quiet and really wants nothing to do with this. Elspeth is gossipy and active, and we see this pairing a lot in Christie of like the middle-aged slash elderly brother and sister duo. And we see this in A Caribbean Mystery with the Prescotts, and more notably in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd with the Shepherds. The Griffiths from The Moving Finger are also this dynamic, although they're a little younger, and the roles there are reversed somewhat. But I think this book could have used more Elspeth McKay. It's not that she's like so interesting, but Poirot uses her to arrange his thoughts, which is something I normally would find as filler material, but this book is so scattered, it really needed it. And why he uses Elspeth McKay instead of Mrs. Oliver, I don't know. But I think there is an argument that Mrs. McKay sort of usurps some of the Mrs. Oliver role away from her, but in a pleasant way. But it didn't. She didn't seem like a necessary character, though I didn't mind her at all. And that is it for this video. Let me know what you think about Halloween Party in the comments below. There are many other characters I could have talked about, like Mrs. Goodbody, the village witch is one, but I mean, there just like isn't a lot to say about her, other than that she was fun for the brief moment she appeared. Next week, I will have a video that gets suggested a lot, actually, and I will be looking into the titles of Christie, and I mean the actual titles. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will discuss what makes a good title, what makes a bad title, some of my favorite and least favorite Christie titles, maybe some alternate titles and foreign language titles as well. So stay tuned for that, and happy Halloween, everyone. Stay safe, and don't go bopping for apples in a murderer's library. And definitely don't announce you've seen a murder at a Halloween party this year. Until next time, Mystery Files.